come to Prime Minister's question. Samir Khan.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, tomorrow marks 13 years since 6 young British soldiers were on patrol in Afghanistan when their vehicle was struck by an explosive, tragically killing them all. Sergeant Nigel Coop was 33. Corporal Jake Hartley was 20. Private Anthony Frampton was 20. Private Daniel Wade was 20. Private Daniel Wilford was 21. And Private Christopher Kershaw was just 19, a teenager. Tomorrow also marks the 18th anniversary of the death of Benjamin Reddy, a 22-year-old serving with 42 Commando Royal Marines, killed in Helmand Provost in 2007. These men fought and died for their country, our country. And across the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, 642 individuals died fighting for Britain alongside our allies. Many more were wounded. We will never forget their bravery and their sacrifice. And I know the whole House will join in me in remembering them and all those who serve our country. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Samir Khan.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has rightly made growth his key mission. But can he outline for my constituents in Southampton Test how our employment rights bill will not only deliver improvements for them, but also put more money in their pockets as part of our plan?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. She's doing a fantastic job for her constituents. The Employment Rights Bill is the biggest upgrade to workers' rights in a generation. Benefit more than 10 million workers in every corner of the country. It will tackle low pay, poor conditions and poor job security that hold our country back. It is pro-worker, pro-business and pro-growth.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Berdal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Divisions between Ukraine and the US only serve Vladimir Putin. President Zelensky is right to try and rebuild his relationship with President Trump. He is keeping a cool head under very difficult circumstances. And I was glad to see President Trump receive his letter positively. What is the Prime Minister doing to help rebuild their relationship after a challenging week?
Minister.
Well, she's absolutely right that we need to do everything we can to ensure that the US, Europe and Ukraine are working together on lasting peace. And I'm doing everything I can to play my part in that, in regular contact with all of the key players at the moment, including talking to President Zelensky yesterday afternoon.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for that answer. All of us in this House know that the British Armed Forces are a huge source of pride to our country. They put themselves in harm's way to defend our values. As the opposition, we support efforts to resolve this conflict, but we cannot write a blank cheque. If British peacekeeping troops in Ukraine were attacked, whether directly or via proxies, we could be drawn into conflict with Russia. Can the Prime Minister reassure all those who are concerned about the UK being drawn into war?
Minister.
Yes, that's the last thing anybody wants to see. And the whole point of ensuring that there's a lasting peace and that any deal, if there's a deal, is defended, is to avoid conflict, to ensure that we do have peace. The way to ensure we have peace is to ensure there are guarantees for any deal that is in place, because the surest risk that there would be conflict is if Putin thinks that he can breach any deal that may be arrived at.
The Prime Minister is quite right, and we on this side of the House agree with him. The objective for his visit to Washington was to get that US security guarantee for Ukraine, and I commend his efforts in this very difficult task. But nonetheless, on Monday, the United States withdrew military aid for Ukraine. Can he update the House on the steps he is taking to persuade America that it is also in their national interest to provide a security guarantee?
Prime Minister.
I'm pleased to inform the House that On Thursday of last week, we did discuss security guarantees. The President made absolutely clear his commitment to Article 5 of NATO, absolutely clear that he would have our backs because of the relationship between our parties, and agreed that our teams would sit down together to talk through security guarantees. I've spoken to him, I think, 3 times since then on the telephone, because it is vitally important that we work with the US, with Europe and Ukraine and make sure that if there is a deal, it has proper security guarantees in place.
Kevin Bednall.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is not able to comment on specific intelligence matters, and I'm certainly not asking him to do that. However, there are concerning reports that the United States has instructed Britain to suspend intelligence sharing with Ukraine, and other reports that Five Eyes itself may be at risk. We need to make sure America does not disengage. There are some in this House who argue Europe should go it alone. But does he agree with me that without this country's greatest ally, any peace agreement would place a terrible burden on Britain and our taxpayers?
Prime Minister.
Well, I do agree with her wholeheartedly, and that's why in the debate we had just 2 days ago, I've always been clear that we need to ensure that the US, the UK, Europe and Ukraine are working together, but we must not choose between the US and Europe. We never have historically, and we're not going to do so now.
Kevin Bednall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his comments on that. He will know that it is not just the security situation that worries people. They are also concerned about trade wars and the economic impact of tariffs, like those levelled on Canada and Mexico yesterday. The best way to avoid America putting tariffs on Britain is to reach agreement on a US trade deal. Following the Prime Minister's trip to Washington, have talks on a UK-US trade deal begun?
Prime Minister.
Well, I was pleased in the meeting I had last week that we did discuss an economic deal and agreed that our teams would indeed sit down rapidly to talk through an economic deal, and that is what they're doing, because, as she rightly says, that is far better than getting drawn into conflict in relation to tariffs.
Kevin Bednall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the Prime Minister has confirmed that those talks have started. People across our country are worried. They're worried about national security. They're worried about whether we can equip our military fast enough. They are worried about whether we will deploy troops in Ukraine and whether we will be able to keep the peace. They are also worried about our economic security. Can we afford all this? The world is changing fast, and we need an entirely new approach to our economy and our energy security. The budget last year halted growth with higher taxes and higher borrowing. Yesterday, farmers were protesting in Whitehall again. People are hurting. Will he now change course so we can have the economic security we know we need for our national security?
Prime Minister.
We were doing so well. What we inherited was insecurity in our economy. We inherited a 22 billion black hole, and we have now turned that around. We've got the highest investment coming into our economy. We've got wages higher than prices. We've got 3 times interest rates have been cut. That's the difference between stability with Labour and instability with the party opposite.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Prime Minister for his decisive leadership that he has shown in Europe and at home to bolster our collective security. The £13.4 billion increase in defence spending has been very much welcomed in my constituency of Stevenage. Can the Prime Minister outline how that increase in defence spending will boost jobs and growth in places like Stevenage, and would he like to join me in visiting some of those businesses?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question. Our plan for change is built on national security, and that has to go hand in hand with economic security. And as we're returning to 2.5% for the first time since a Labour government, that investment must mean UK skills, UK jobs and UK apprenticeships. And I was very pleased that on Monday we were able to announce a new hub and new spending targets to help 12,000 SMEs access the supply chain, which will boost economic growth, and that'll be really important in so many constituencies. And of course I'll consider his invitation.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I visited Kingston's Army Reserve Centre, met members of the Royal Army Medical Service who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan very bravely. So can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's initial remarks? On Monday, the Prime Minister rightly said a minerals deal only was not a sufficient security guarantee for Ukraine. But since then, the Trump administration has said that a minerals deal is the only guarantee on the table, and President Trump has removed military aid from Ukraine and said that the British cannot share American intelligence with Kyiv. Both those decisions mean more brave Ukrainians will die and further embolden Vladimir Putin. So can the Prime Minister tell the House, does he still believe that President Trump is a reliable ally? And if Ukraine does not get a sufficient security guarantee from this White House, what is the Prime Minister's plan B?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, look, we work very closely with the United States on defence, on security and on intelligence. We have done for many, many years. We're intertwined, and of course they're a reliable ally. We are operating on that basis day in, day out across the world, as he knows. In relation to the situation as it develops, obviously our main focus, our only focus, is on a lasting peace in Ukraine. There are many moving parts, there are many discussions to be had, but what I'm doing is staying focused on what I think is the single most important outcome, which is a lasting peace in Ukraine, which is good for Ukraine, for Europe, and of course essential for the United Kingdom.
Sir Ed Davey.
The Prime Minister knows we all support him in that effort. But can I take him back to President Trump's reliability? 4 British women have accused Andrew Tate of rape and human trafficking, and British police have issued arrest warrants. The Tates have tried to escape justice, first to Romania, now to the United States, but I'm delighted that Florida has thankfully opened a criminal investigation. But does the Prime Minister agree that people who are wanted by British police of such appalling crimes should stand trial in our country? And given his assessment that President Trump really is a reliable ally, will his government request an urgent extradition of the Tate brothers?
Prime Minister.
This is a live issue, as he'll appreciate, and therefore I'll tread carefully. But the principle is absolutely clear. Justice must be done in all cases, including in this case. But I won't go into the details because this is a live case, as he knows.
Steve Race.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm supporting many parents in Exeter who are struggling to get the support they need for their children within the SEND system run by Devon County Council. One parent told me that their child was excelling, but after undergoing major surgery, she needed additional support to get back into a mainstream school setting. That hasn't been possible due to the disarray of the SEND system in Devon, and this child is now missing out. I welcome the new money going to the system. Can the Prime Minister provide an update on government work that will also reform the SEND system to make sure every child in Exeter has the best start in life?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank him for raising this familiar topic. We inherited a SEND system that failed to meet the needs of children and families, and that's why we're investing £1 billion in SEND alongside £740 million for councils to improve inclusivity and expertise in mainstream schools and to make sure special schools can cater for children with the most complex needs. We're working closely with partners in Devon to deliver an accelerated progress plan and have deployed SEND advisors to offer support to the local authority.
Liz Roberts.
By cozying up to Putin, Trump is making Europe less safe. We all recognise the need for Europe to adapt. Germany is changing its fiscal rules to boost investment in defence and infrastructure, creating a €500 billion fund to strengthen its future. Will the Prime Minister please consider a similar approach, focusing on strategic investment rather than imposing further hardship on the poorest through cuts to welfare and cuts to international aid?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as she knows, I think it's very important, if we're to increase defence spending, which we are, to have that fully costed, fully funded, and to put that plan before the House, which is what I did last week. But she talks about fiscal rules, she talks about funding. I have to say, it was highly regrettable that Plaid voted against £1.6 billion to fund public services in Wales. She needs to explain how that helps her constituents and the people of Wales.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This year marks 40 years since the Swan Report exposed systemic racism and discrimination in the education system. And regrettably, none of those recommendations were implemented. One of the most damning injustices in that report was the misclassification of mainly black children as educationally subnormal, as identified in Steve McKean's BBC documentary. And given the historic nature of this and the impact it had on so many, will the Prime Minister consider a public inquiry to provide justice and recompense for those who have been affected?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank her for raising this really important issue. All children, young people, must be treated fairly, and there's no place for hate or prejudice in our education system. I'll make sure she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss this further.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, President Trump has ended military aid to Ukraine, reportedly banned the UK sharing US intelligence with Ukraine, and is now seeking to lift sanctions with Russia to appease Vladimir Putin, a murderous, lying dictator. Regrettably, it's clear for now the US can no longer be relied upon for security and peace in Europe. So will the Prime Minister provide leadership to our allies by urgently making the decision to be the first leader to release seized Russian state assets to Ukraine under the established principle of international law, so that Putin must pay as the aggressor?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on the question of assets, obviously we're using the profits, the interest on the assets, to help fund Ukraine, and we are looking with others at whether it's possible to go further, and obviously I'll update the House if that's possible. But I have to say, at a time when defence and security in Europe, in the UK, needs to be ramped up for all the reasons that he readily understands, for the SNP to maintain its position that it wants to get rid of the single most effective deterrent that we have, the nuclear deterrent, really has to be explained in its historical context.
Paul Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour is rolling out free breakfast clubs in primary schools, starting with 750 schools, including Scapegoat Hill Junior Infants School in my constituency. Under the Tories, only 1 in 10 schools had these clubs. Labour will make them available for all children. This will help break down barriers to opportunity for every child. I know the Prime Minister is as determined as I am to tear away the link between background and success. So will you update the House on how we are going to do that through Labour's plan for change?
Minister.
Well, I thank him for his question. Labour promised free breakfast clubs in every primary school, and the first 750 will open in April, giving every child the best start in life through our plan for change. It will also put up to £450 a year back in the pockets of working families. I'm delighted, Mr. Speaker, to say that 2 of the breakfast clubs will be opening in the constituency of the Leader of the Opposition in April, and I hope she'll welcome them when they do.
Ian Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the Prime Minister talked about creating defence jobs across the country as we rebuild our defence industrial capacity. So will he and the government bring forward an urgent plan for skills in the defence sector? And does he agree with his Education Secretary that the strategy for defence skills should sit purely under the Department for Education and an underpowered executive agency?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this, because it is a duty to increase our spending on defence and security, but it also does provide an opportunity for jobs across the country, and that's good jobs, well-paid jobs, skilled jobs, as he rightly identifies, but also jobs with a real sense of pride, and we are working on that.
Emma Lulberg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My lovely granddad, John Henry Richardson, passed away in 1998 from work-related asbestos exposure. Today in South Shields, we have one of the highest death rates from this silent killer in the United Kingdom. Will the Prime Minister please look at introducing a national digital register so we know where this asbestos is and commit to a phased removal of it from public buildings?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm sure I speak for the whole House when I say I'm very sorry to hear what happened to her grandfather. These are just awful cases, and the deaths are terrible. I've no doubt he was a wonderful man. He would have been, no doubt, very proud to have seen her in her place today. And I'll make sure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
Sir Oliver Dundon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. St Hilda's Girls' School looks set to join Emmanuel Jewish Prep as the second school in Bushey alone forced to close because of Labour's VAT hike. This is a double hit to aspiration. First, the parents, many of whom not wealthy, who have described the significant sacrifices they have made to send their children to these schools. And secondly, to the excellent local state schools, including the one that I attended, which simply do not have the places, meaning this policy won't even save money. So may I therefore urge the Prime Minister, even at this late stage, to look again at the failures in this policy.
Prime Minister.
I don't doubt the aspirations of all parents in relation to their children. But I mean all parents. What we've been able to do is to make sure we release the funding to ensure that our state secondary schools have the teachers they need. And there's no point the party opposite pretending that they're interested in state education when they left them without the teaching they needed.
Dr. Ray Tidball.
Thank you, Mr.
There is no punchline. I presume something was said that shouldn't have been said. I'm sure the member would like to withdraw what was said, if they've anything about them. Withdrawn. There we are. Let's carry on. Dr. Maria Tidball.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 48 children that we know of have been killed by known domestically abusive parents during court-permitted contact visits, including Paul and Jack Seitz, who were tragically murdered at the hands of their father in a house fire. Their mother, my constituent Claire Throssell, has campaigned against the presumption of contact, which allows such abusers to have unsupervised contact with their children. Will the Prime Minister meet with Claire and I to discuss the urgent need to remove the presumption of contact in law?
Prime Minister. Well, can I pay tribute to my honourable friend and to my honourable friend, the member for Calder Valley, who've both raised this critical issue? And can I particularly pay tribute to Claire? Her courage and strength is outstanding. Mr. Speaker, family courts must never be used as a tool that domestic abusers can use to continue their appalling abuse. And we're expanding a number of pathfinder courts to protect the welfare of children and reviewing the presumption of involvement that she raises.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Daniel Coffey from Columpton lost his life while serving in Iraq. His grandfather said yesterday that Vice President J.D. Vance should have a lot more respect for those who lost their lives, in response to the Vance comment that some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. Will the Prime Minister gently remind the US government the UK was there for the US following the 9/11 attacks when Lord Robertson invoked Article 5, and that we were there for the US for the intervention in Iraq? And they might remember our long-standing friendship when we think about security guarantees for Ukraine.
Prime Minister. Well, I thank him for raising this. I know he speaks for the whole House. We do remember the role that we've played historically with our allies, and we particularly remember those that made the ultimate sacrifice in that duty for their country and for our allies, and that's why it's so important that we make that point today.
Parin Mood.
Muraz Gul Peran Lowen. Happy St. Piran's Day, Mr. Speaker. To the hundreds of thousands of people in Cornwall and around the world who are today celebrating St. Piran's Day, will the Prime Minister confirm our government's commitment to national minority status for Cornwall, and will he join me in wishing Cornish folk the world over a very happy St. Piran's Day?
Prime Minister.
Well, yes, let me wish him, his constituents and everyone in Cornwall a very happy St Piran's Day. We do recognise Cornish national minority status, not just the language, the history and the culture of Cornwall, but its bright future. And I know that he and Cornish colleagues will continue to be powerful voices for Cornwall.
Sir David Davis.
Four weeks ago, the Northern Ireland coroner accused British soldiers of unlawful killing after they engaged with IRA would-be murderers. After careful reading, as far as I can see, this judgment was based on no evidence whatsoever. Over 100 Special Forces soldiers have been summoned before these inquiries. Not one IRA leader has been summoned in the same way. Soldiers that serve our country with honour, heroism and skill are being punished in their declining years for doing nothing but carrying out their patriotic duty with enormous risks. Now, given how he opened his comments today, which I associate myself with, does he not think that he and his government have a duty to protect these soldiers from such partisan parodies of justice in their declining years?
On the particular case, the coroner's ruling, I just haven't seen the details, I'm afraid, so I can't comment on that. On the broader point, it's right that we should protect those who serve our country, wherever they serve our country. Getting the balance right is critically important. I didn't think that the legislation that was put forward by the party opposite achieved that, but nonetheless, I do believe that in the interests of everybody in Northern Ireland, all those who served and all those who are victims, we do need to renew our efforts to find a way forward on this really important issue.
Helena Donegal.
Mr Speaker, my constituents in Hastings Rye and the villages are fed up with the constant failures of Southern Water, dumping sewage in our sea, flooding and leaving us without water for days, all while taking huge bonuses. At the Environment Select Committee, we've been hauling in the water bosses one by one and hearing about their failures. But the boss of Southern Water there finally agreed to give my constituents millions in compensation for a major water outage. Can the Prime Minister tell me how this Labour government is cracking down on the bad behaviour of the water industry?
Can I applaud her for her dedicated work on the Environment Committee and obviously in her constituency. Last week, our Water Act became law, which gives new powers to ban the payment of bonuses for polluting water bosses and bringing criminal charges against lawbreakers. We are determined, Mr Speaker, to fix our broken water system after years of companies pumping sewage into our waterways and infrastructure not keeping pace with demand.
Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I pay tribute to the Prime Minister for his efforts to bring Europe together and ensure we can work to restore peace in Ukraine. What the war in Ukraine has also demonstrated, though, is the need for greater food security and stronger supply chains. But if this government forces our farmers to sell their land because of the divisive family farm tax, then it undermines this. So ahead of the spring statement, I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, will he think this policy through again and seek to end it? Because national security needs food security, it needs farming and it needs farmers.
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, we put a record amount in the budget into farming, £5 billion. We've set out a roadmap for farming, which has been welcomed across by the NFU. And as she knows, the vast majority of farms will not be affected by the provisions that we're putting in place.
Lee Pitcher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. For months, my constituents in Doncaster East and Isle of Axholme have been telling me how fed up they are with not being able to get an appointment because of the 8 AM scramble. The last thing they need when they're ill is to have to pick up that phone and wait and fight again to be first. It's great news that the government's new GP contract will start to resolve this. But can the Prime Minister reassure my residents who can't use technology that they will still be able to book an appointment?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for this. Last week, for the first time in 4 years, the BMA agreed the GP contract with the government worth an extra £889 million. Patients will be able to request appointments online from October, but I can absolutely reassure my honourable friend and others that this will free up the phones for those who need them most and help end the 8 AM scramble.
Rosie Duffy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Under his Labour government, does the Prime Minister believe the UK's estimated 3 million millionaires should contribute more to our vital national security? Or is it just the world's poorest by no longer benefiting from our international aid programmes, or the shameful almost 6 million children living in poverty in this country who should be paying for it? What happened to the wealth tax, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
Well, I think all should and all do make a contribution at this vital time.
Mike Tapp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These are delicate moments for the country, and the Prime Minister has led with British values, moral courage, decency, as a true statesman, and with skilled and careful diplomacy. All elected politicians in this House, Mr. Speaker, must appreciate that everything we say could impact that diplomacy. Does the Prime Minister agree that a united House could help us achieve that lasting peace?
Well, let me broaden out his words to the whole House, because I do think that it's hugely to the credit of this House that it is speaking loudly in a united way with one voice in the face of Russian aggression. And that is why we must have lasting peace based on the sovereignty and security of Ukraine. But it certainly helps to all of those observing across the world to see this House speaking powerfully with one voice, united across these benches, and I'm very pleased that we're able to continue in that way.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scottish fishing industry, by volume and value, is the biggest in these islands. And within my constituency, the port towns of Peterhead and Fraserburgh represent a very large share of that industry in terms of the land it catch and its processing. Now, I'm sure the Prime Minister enjoys the occasional fish supper. So does he agree that their interests and their future must be secured and enhanced as his government pursues economic growth and resets its relationship with the European Union, especially through the forthcoming trade and cooperation agreement negotiations, so that the jobs of the people who work in this sector can never be made expendable for the sake of some other interest?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank you for raising this, and do recognise the huge and historic importance of the fishing industry in his constituency and others. I'm determined to make the sector more secure, sustainable and economically successful. We've already secured over 720,000 tonnes of fishing quota for the year, worth up to £920 million, including agreements with the EU and with Norway. We also want to tackle problems about labour shortages that he will be familiar with. I'm pleased that his constituents in Peterhead will benefit from £20 million under our plan for neighbourhood, but absolutely do everything we can in relation to this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Medway Maritime Hospital in my constituency of Gillingham and Raynham has today received a very concerning CQC report following an inspection of the emergency department in February last year. Testimonies include patients having to wait up to 50 hours to be seen, and others being told to soil themselves because there were staff that were not available to take them to the bathroom. Will the Prime Minister please outline what this government will urgently do to tackle the crisis in our NHS after 14 years of absolute Tory mismanagement?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank her for raising this case. Her constituents deserve the highest standard of care. The party opposite left the NHS in an absolutely dire state. We're investing £26 billion, and our reform plan will cut waiting lists. And I'm really pleased, Mr. Speaker, to say that waiting lists are down, and we've delivered over 2 million extra appointments to get the NHS back on its feet.
Final question, Richard Holden.
Thank you very much. A marriage between first cousins carries significant health issues, many of which aren't even knowable until post-birth. When practiced generation after generation, there is a significant multiplier effect. In addition, the real impacts for the openness of our society and women's rights in our country are also significant. After all, there are significant dynamics in sharing the same set of grandparents. On Friday, this government has a choice to let my bill go through to ban first cousin marriage to committee stage. Will the Prime Minister think again before instructing his whips to block this legislation?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've taken our position on that bill. Thank you.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.